Let's discuss Donald Trump finally. After all of the incidents that have taken place, the anti-Semitic incidents that we've had, the uptick in anti-Semitism, all of the things that are going on, Donald Trump finally addresses anti-Semitism in a speech today at the African American Museum, the new African American History Museum in D.C., which he took a tour of along with Ben Carson and I believe not Bernice King, but one of the King individuals related to Dr. King. In that speech, he finally addressed. Now, this is after a long list of anti-Semitic attacks, threats, desecrations, to the point where people are really looking at the president saying, Mr. President, are you going to say anything? And even his daughter finally hinted towards the anti-Semitism. And the fact that he was silent was magnified by his intentional erasure of the Jewish people in his Holocaust Remembrance Day. He did not mention the Jewish people. He didn't mention anti-Semitism, not one time. And in that absence, in that void, it left a lot of people wondering, what indeed does Donald Trump think about what's going on? Here's his statement today at the African American History Museum. Let's take a listen in.
Who joined the Union Army. He believed that his fellow African Americans always looked to the United States as the promised land of universal freedom. Today and every day of my presidency, I pledge to do everything I can to continue that promise of freedom for African Americans and for every American. So important, nothing more important. This tour was a meaningful reminder of why we have to fight bigotry, intolerance, and hatred in all of its very ugly forms. The anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community and community centers are horrible and are painful, and a very sad reminder of the work that still must be done to root out hate and prejudice and evil.
All right, so it was a 2-for-1. I guess he figured he was touring the Black Museum. He should say something about, let's just get it all out of the way, right? So he gives these platitudes about the plight of African Americans and the struggle of African Americans, and then he ties it in, finally mentioning anti-Semitism. Now, I find this highly ironic coming from people who swear that the first way to fight back against terrorism is to call it by its name, radical Islamic terrorism. And because they have no distinct way of fighting the war on terror differently than President Obama did, their only solution has been to call it what it is. Now, these people who are obsessed with calling terrorism radical Islamic terrorism, because if you can't name it, then you can't identify it and you can't attack it. These people, President Trump, foremost among them, could not bring himself to actually say the word anti-Semitic until today. Not in context of addressing the rise in anti-Semitism. In fact, we discussed it last week when a Jewish reporter asked him a question about the rise in anti-Semitism. He went off on a tangent about how he's the least racist person in the world. So for people who feel like it's very important for us to identify a problem, why is President Trump just now addressing the real problem in the uptick in anti-Semitism? Possibly, very likely, because the people in his base, there is a core constituency that Donald Trump has that does not believe the Holocaust even occurred. And then you have those who believe it occurred, but then they want to diminish the fact that it was a genocidal attack on Jewish people, right? You have all these subtle shades of erasure and then just outright bold-faced anti-Semitism that comes from Donald Trump's base. So it's not really possible for Donald Trump to address anti-Semitism without speaking down to his base. Not only his base, but some of his key leadership. Steve Bannon, of which is probably the chief anti-Semitic official in the American government right now. And so Donald Trump couldn't bring himself to say anything up until this, until we saw the desecration of the graves, the grave sites, until we saw all of the bomb threats by the Jewish community centers across the country. And finally, Ivanka, his daughter, said something about it on Twitter. So it was a progression, a begrudging progression from a complete erasure on Holocaust Remembrance Day to what it is today. He finally addresses it. I guess he gets some cookies or some bonus points for finally addressing something, and then trying to do a 2-for-1. If he's got to get in trouble with his base, he might as well talk about black people and anti-Semitism in the same breath, the same sentence. Well, it did not play well. It did not play well with several Jewish organizations. This is a statement coming from, I believe it's the Anne Frank Center, in response to President Trump's comments. They said, quote, "The president's sudden acknowledgement of anti-Semitism is a Band-Aid on the cancer of anti-Semitism that has infected his own administration. His statement today is a pathetic asterisk of condescension after weeks in which he and his staff have committed grotesque acts of omissions reflecting anti-Semitism, yet day after day have refused to apologize and correct the record. Make no mistake, the anti-Semitism coming out of this administration is the worst we have ever seen from any administration." Now, to that, Sean Spicer, the press secretary, addressed it and essentially said that, the Anne Frank Foundation should be happy, should be satisfied. They should be satisfied because President Trump has addressed it, and of doing the job of the propagandist that he is, rather. He made it seem as though this is something President Trump has previously addressed, and that is factually untrue. President Trump just today, first time addressing the anti-Semitism, the uptick in anti-Semitism that is, quite frankly, the result of his administration and his campaign and the style of campaign that he ran. Well, in response to Sean Spicer, this is a tweet that was sent out, and it's on your screen here now. The Anne Frank Center, I said foundation, but it is the Anne Frank Center. They said the White House says that our organization should praise President Trump on anti-Semitism. Well, then fire Steve Bannon. Quite right. If you really want to send a signal that you're serious about anti-Semitism and opposing anti-Semitism, then you have to get rid of the most anti-Semitic person in the government, the highest ranking anti-Semite in the government, Steve Bannon. Otherwise, it's all just smoke and mirrors.